This is the city of Jerusalem. It's a model of the old city of Jerusalem. Everything that you see here exists in some form still in the international city of Jerusalem. But this is exactly what it would have looked like in Jesus' last days of that very first Holy Week. We're going to look at what Jesus and his disciples, where they traveled, who they saw and talked to, all of those things that will help us enter more deeply into the mystery of the Triduum. The old city of Jerusalem is actually built on two levels. That's why you see lower parts and higher parts that would often be accessed by stairs. The city of Jerusalem was built as a fortress, so all of these walls are very, very high. If you think about our own Gleason building here on the campus of St. Giles, they'd be at least the size of that. Very tall. And they surrounded the city. There would be wells on the outside of the city for people to take their animals to. And there would also be cisterns inside the city to protect the city in times of siege so that people could access clean water and stay alive much longer. As you can see the different buildings, there was one very important building that was part of the walls. This is called the Tower of Antonio. It is where the Roman soldiers stayed. You'll notice it's much higher than the walls themselves. It is so high that it actually overlooked the temple area, the holiest site in all of Jerusalem for the Jewish people. They could look into the open courtyard and watch the Jews and listen to them, just in case they were planning any kind of coup over the top of the Roman occupation. The Temple Mount now, the temple is no longer there, but this is what it would have looked like in the time of Jesus. There was the courtyard area, there was the worship area, and then there was the Holy of Holies. Jesus and his disciples entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. That's what we're going to celebrate, what we did celebrate on Palm Sunday. And everybody was cheering. They most likely came over the Kidron Valley and in through one of the many gates of the city. Now, they were preparing for Passover, so they would have gone up to what we now know as the Cenacle. The Cenacle means upper room. Most buildings actually had an upper room where people would sleep, where they would dine. Because Jerusalem is in the Judea region of Israel, it's very hot. It's in the middle of a desert. So people would be on the upper level for their eating and their sleeping because it was cooler. So Cenacle actually means upper room. On Holy Thursday, what we celebrate today, Jesus and his disciples prepared the Passover meal. And our Easter is determined by both a lunar calendar and a solar calendar. Passover and many of the Jewish high holidays is determined by a lunar calendar. This year, 2020, it is unique that they absolutely coincide. So while we are celebrating Holy Thursday, which we celebrate as the Last Supper, our Jewish brothers and sisters are celebrating the Passover, which was the meal that Jesus and his disciples celebrated in the Cenacle that night. That night, Jesus did something very different. It wasn't part of the usual Passover meal. He lifted up the bread and he broke it, and as he did so, he said to his disciples, "Take, Eat. This is my body given up for you." Then he took the chalice, or the cup, and he said to his disciples, "Take, drink. This is my blood that will be poured out for you." Can you imagine what they must have thought? These were very unusual words, and maybe they didn't understand. They probably didn't understand what it meant. After they had feasted, Jesus and the disciples left the cenacle. They went down to the lower part of the city of Jerusalem. They went out one of the gates, and they crossed the Kidron Valley once again. This time, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is just that. It still exists, it's still there, and it's a hill. And there are olive trees all over it. In fact, at the bottom of the hill, near the church that is now built there are olive trees that were there the night that Jesus came to pray. It is called, that area, the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive press. So what would happen is that when they harvested the olives, they would shake the trees and they would roll down the hill to the very bottom of the hill, and they would be pressed into olive oil. That's why that area, the garden area, is called the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knew what was going to happen. His disciples weren't sure. Only a few days before, they had entered Jerusalem in celebration. People were laying down their cloaks and waving palm fronds and greeting Jesus as king. But Jesus knew that that was just for that day. He knew that suffering was going to happen. So he went away from his disciples a little bit, and he went to go pray to God. He actually said to God, "If this be your will, I will do it. But if not, take the cup from me." Jesus is fully human and fully divine. He knew what suffering felt like, and of course he didn't want to go through that. But he listened to God, and that's why he was praying, listening. His disciples, however, fell asleep several times during that night. Jesus would come back to them and say, "You cannot stay awake for me?" That is why on Holy Thursday now, we stay awake at least until midnight, so that somebody is always with Jesus on this very important night. Towards the end of the evening, when it was early morning hours, a group of Roman soldiers and Judas, his betrayer, came and greeted Jesus and the other disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas went and kissed him, and from that, the Roman soldiers knew who to arrest. They took him, they bound him, at least his hands, maybe his feet, and walked him all the way back across the Kidron Valley, through the gates of the city, and first took him to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate said, "I see nothing wrong with this man. Take him to your own people." So they did. They took him to the head priest, Caiaphas. Caiaphas questioned him. Jesus would not answer. They were very angry and sent him back to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate again saw nothing wrong. And so he said, "No, I see nothing wrong with this man. You need to try him under your own laws." Now, given that this was Holy Week, Pilate knew that King Herod, who was the king of the Jews at that time, the Jewish people, he would have been in his palace in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Herod was very interested in meeting Jesus because he had heard about all of the miracles he had done in Galilee. So he greeted him. Jesus refused to answer him. Again, the Jews took him back to Pontius Pilate. Pilate was very, very worried that there was going to be a riot because all of the high priests and the Jewish leaders had incited the people to ask for Jesus to be punished. Because it was the Passover, Pilate always made an offer to the people to release one of their prisoners. There was another prisoner who was also scheduled to be punished. His name was Barabbas, and he had led a rebellion. The people asked for Barabbas instead of Jesus. When Pilate asked what would he do with Jesus, they said, "Crucify him." And at that point, Jesus' fate was sealed. They took him back into the praetorium. They stripped him. They beat him. They put a crown of thorns on him. And then they handed him a very large cross. Today, in the city of Jerusalem, you can walk the same way that Jesus did. It's called the Via Dolorosa, the Trail of Tears. They would have made him carry this very heavy cross up those steps through very narrow passages, all the way to the point outside the city gates called Golgotha, or the place of the skull. Now the streets of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, are very, very narrow. They're narrow as like a hallway that you might see in your school or any of the buildings here on campus. People were shopping. It was a regular day. This was normal. How many people didn't pay attention to Jesus and his suffering during that walk? How many people looked away in shame? How many people looked away and just didn't want to be involved? When they got him out to the place of the skull, Golgotha, they nailed him to a cross, and they put him up on the cross in between two other prisoners who were being crucified. It was not an easy way to die. It was painful, it was often lonely, and he was taunted by all those around him, except for his mother, who was at the foot of the cross, and a few other people. Normally, it would take people days to die through crucifixion. However, Jesus gave up his spirit at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on that day. The scripture tells us that there was an earthquake and that the curtain that covered the holiest of holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was held in the temple, that curtain was rent from top to bottom, completely torn in two, that the sky turned dark. When they went to go see if Jesus had died yet, they noticed that he already had succumbed, and they pierced his side and water came out. They took him down from the cross, and his followers asked if they could have his body. So they prepared it minimally for burial. Now nearby, there was a tomb that had been carved into the side of the hill, and nobody had ever been buried there. So they prepared his body the best they could before the Sabbath. They put him into the tomb. However, the Jewish leaders told Pilate that Jesus had claimed that he would rise again 3 days later if anything should happen to him. And they were afraid that his disciples would come and steal his body and claim that. So they asked Pilate to roll a heavy stone in front of the tomb and to position guards outside it. So Pilate agreed. His disciples went away very, very sad that day. They had remembered all that they had experienced with Jesus, all the miracles, all the teachings of love. And just as we celebrate Christmas as the time when that very special light came into the world, they remembered the light that they experienced when they were with Jesus. On that day, on that very first Good Friday, that light went out. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. But we know that's not the end of the story. Our story and Jesus' story did not end on that Good Friday. Instead, Mary Magdalene and 2 other women came to the tomb on that Sunday morning to prepare his body properly for burial, now that the Sabbath was over. They were very worried because they knew that there was guards and they knew that there was a stone in front of the tomb. However, when they arrived, not only were the soldiers knocked unconscious, but the tomb was rolled away already for them. They went in and saw nothing. Some scripture shows that there was a man in white or an angel who spoke to them and said, "Why are you looking for Jesus? He has risen. He is no longer here." And at first they didn't believe it, but then they came to believe. And on that Easter Sunday morning, that same Easter we will celebrate in just a couple of days, that light came back with so much power and so much love. It burns even brighter today. And the biggest reason it burns so bright is because we have this light in each and every one of us. We receive it again at baptism, and we are called to share it. In this time where we feel lost and there's darkness, it is on us to share the light and the hope and the love, because we are an Easter people. We live the resurrection. Remember this and be Christ for one another. Have a blessed Easter.